Hi folks, welcome to another video on the channel. Thanks for joining me. And today what I'm going to do is a video which is going to do a lot for the people who like to use Photoshop and bring to bear on their images the masking power of Photoshop, which is, even though the masking in Darktable is really good, it's just not even on a par with what you can do inside of Photoshop. So, you know, I mean, there is a very valid reason why people want to work on their images inside Photoshop, and also to utilise the digital asset management power and the printing module power, etc. of Lightroom, but find that on some of their images, Lightroom does an absolutely appalling job of processing the raw file, because Lightroom is a pretty good raw processor, but it's a bit of a jack of all trades and master of pretty much none. So that's where the power of Darktable really comes to the fore, and of raw therapy as well. But as I'm getting more familiar with Darktable, sort of raw therapy is dropping into sort of second place on certain types of raw files, because it hasn't got the actual spectrum of leverage with multiple instances of modules, etc., and masking on all the modules that Darktable's got. But to be honest, in the terms of the three main raw processors that I use, Lightroom is the bottom of the heap. Okay, but Photoshop is a different beast altogether. And those people that have Photoshop have a massive problem with Darktable in the fact that it will not interface very well at all, with an external editor. But the other day, I actually came up with a solution, and I did a video for my Patreon members, and it went down a storm, so I thought I'd better do it for you guys over on YouTube as well. If I go and switch to raw therapy, you can see that over in the preferences panel we have an external editor section where I can choose to open this image, say, and it's in the background in Photoshop, or I could open it in Photoshop Beta, and the output directory will be the same as the input image, because that's what I like. I always like to keep my TIFFs next to my raw files, which we use to, you know, create the TIFFs in the first place. But that's something we can't very easily do in Darktable, because you've got to remember where the bloody raw file is in the first place. And that's been the perennial problem with Darktable. When you export an image out, it's an untidy workflow, because you've got to remember, or you've got to manually go and find the image that you've just exported and then open it up in Photoshop. So it's an untidy workflow. But if I just click cancel on there, you see I can just, in raw therapy, and this is really good in raw therapy, I can say open in Photoshop Beta, and I just click the little artist panel thing there, and that's done. And here we go, very fine Adobe Photoshop Beta, because it's just had an update. And here we go, opening up. And there it is, and you can see it's coming in at 300 pixels per inch. And document profile is Pro Photo RGB 16 bits per channel, which is lovely. But as I say, we've got no way of doing that inside of Darktable. However, we are left with this problem of how do we get our creations out of Darkroom or out of Darktable and get them in to Photoshop. Well, here's the thing. In Lightroom, we have had for years this thing called, if I go up here, auto import, and it's based on something called a watch folder. Now, for those of you who don't have Adobe products, you might as well click off this video now if you haven't clicked off it already, because it will be of no relevance to you whatsoever, unless you've got an other image processor that you can set up watch folders on. I don't know, but this is for Adobe users. And if we go to auto import, you see I've got this enable auto import checked. You might not have. So if you haven't got it checked, check it, and then this menu will disappear, and you're going to have to come back there in a second. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go over to my Finder, and I'm going to come to a external Thunderbolt drive here on my machine, and I'm just going to go to File, New Folder, and I am going to set up a new folder called Watch Folder. Real simple. Okie dokie. And where is it? Where's it gone? There it is. Watch folder. So as you can see, it's got nothing in it. So I'm going to come back into Lightroom Classic. We're going to go File, Auto Import, and we're going to go to Auto Import Settings. Okay, and I'm going to, you would have to go Choose, and I would choose this watch folder, and then I will put a subfolder in there called DT Edit, and I would just click OK. And so there we go. Now you can see there's nothing come in there at all. However, if I come back to Darktable and I come back to the Lighttable side of Darktable with our image selected, I can now come down to here and export. So I can go to select File on Disk, and then I'll come and click the folder, and I will come down to my external drive and click Watch Folder and go select as output destination. I want to do a normal 16-bit 300 pixel per inch ProPhoto RGB workflow, and so if I go over temporarily back to Darkroom and I go to output color profile, you can see it's going to come out in ProPhoto RGB, which is great. And so we've got the watch folder set up, and it's going to come out as 16-bit unsigned integer, because that means it's not going to be a 16-bit floating point image or a 32-bit floating point image. It's going to be a unsigned integer 16-bit TIFF, which is the way most people who use a Lightroom to Photoshop back to Lightroom workflow, that's the way that works. It's known as an unsigned integer. Uncompressed, right RGB colours, and I'll just go export. And we'll just wait to get the confirmation, which will come up there. There you go. Confirmation that it's been exported to the watch folder. And if I go back to Lightroom, this is quite cool. Look at that. There's that folder called watch folder. And there is our image. Okie dokie. So, of course, once we've got the image, and you've got to say it looks exactly like it looked in Darktable, if we want to take this into Photoshop, we can just go Edit in Photoshop and Edit Original and click Edit, and we'll be away, and you'll see this is opening up in normal Photoshop. So there you go. If we were to come back to Lightroom, there's nothing to stop you working on this TIFF in Lightroom. So there you go. It really is a very simple and very straightforward method of getting your images automatically into the likes of Lightroom and Photoshop if you want to use the Adobe workflow and the Adobe software. Tell you what, that was a short video. That must rank as about the shortest, most concise video I've ever put up on YouTube. I tell you what, shall we go and do something else? Yes, come on. Let's head off back to Darktable, and we've got an HDR DNG here, which Darktable is very, very good at doing. This DNG is created from that raw file, that raw file, that raw file, and that raw file. And then if I open it up, you can see all the processing that I've done on this. There it all is. And so This is a 32-bit floating point TIFF inside a DNG container. And all we're going to do is go to Lighttable, and we are going to, this time, switch from 16-bit to 32-bit float, and uncompressed again, right RGB colours again, and profile pro photo RGB, lovely jubbly, export. And we'll just wait for the confirmation. There we go, confirming the export. Let's go back to Lightroom, and there it is. Now that looks like a bag of spanners, doesn't it? It's read the DNG container and put its usual default junk and rubbish on the image. So all we'll do is just go to oh dear, where are we? Develop settings, reset. And now you can see that's all well and good, but it's looking a little bit on the light side. But you can tell we're working on a 32-bit floating point image inside of Lightroom, because as a rule we would have +5 to -5 on the exposure scale, but here we've got -10 to +10. Okay, so all we're going to do is just bring the exposure down a little bit, and I might take up the clarity a bit and then increase the dehaze, then start taking up the exposure again, and probably leave that about there. Then I'm going to turn the saturation of the image up, and maybe a little bit of vibrance. And then now I've got everything sort of set how I want it to be, I'm going to turn the exposure down a bit, and then very simply use a graduated filter, linear gradient, and we'll bring it up from the bottom to about there, and we'll just give that a little tiny lift in exposure, and maybe squeeze that filter up a bit more, and then lift it up to just above the horizon, and there we go. And that is a 32-bit floating point image, processed, well, assembled and fully processed over in Darktable, and then brought into Lightroom, ready to take into Photoshop should you want to do this sort of thing in Photoshop. Or we could just do this little exercise in Lightroom, then ship it all over to Photoshop, and then obviously at some point along the way it's got to be reduced to an unsigned integer format image in order to do anything more conventional with it, and then we could go and do a little bit of luminosity masking should we so desire over in Photoshop using Greg Benzie's Lumenzia, Tony Kuiper's TK Actions, or whatever. So you open up a whole world of possibilities by throwing the image into Photoshop, but you actually end up with a better quality processing of the original raw file, processing it in the likes of perhaps a raw Therapee, but in this instance Darktable, and Darktable made a much better job of this than raw Therapee would. In fact, I don't even know if you can assemble HDR images in raw Therapee, but anyway, there we go. So our starting point for the development and processing of the image is done from a piece of software which is, to be frank, vastly superior to the initial processing module, if you like, of Lightroom, because Lightroom's demosaicing algorithms they leave a little bit to be desired. Anyway, there we go, guys and gals. I really hope the Adobe users amongst you take note of this little wheeze that I've come across to actually get your Darktable creations into Photoshop, and I hope it encourages a lot of those people who'd sort of steered away from Darktable because they couldn't get their images into the Photoshop workflow very easily, because, you know, maybe they're like me. old and decrepit with not very many grey cells and a really crappy memory. You know, and I click an export button and in Darktable, and as far as I'm concerned, the picture could be blooming anywhere on my computer. So there you go. Anyway, guys and girls, hope you found that useful. Hope you found it interesting. If you have, give it a thumbs up. Tell your friends about it. Give it a like. Give it a share. Leave a nice comment below. And if you fancy supporting the channel, consider either hitting the thanks button below and buying me a coffee, or going over and getting a lot of extra behind-the-scenes support by joining up with my Patreon members site. Okay, guys and gals, it's been great talking to you. I've really enjoyed showing you this little tip for those of you who want to take advantage of it. And so until the next time, stay safe, stay well, keep taking the pictures, and I'll speak to you very soon. Tooroo!